Story 1. Never go camping alone. As with many of the people that post here, I come because very few of my friends believe my story. And similarly to many of the posts here, it does contain suggestions of the paranormal. However, where it differs, is that no matter how hard I try to think of a plausible explanation for how this happened, nothing tangible can explain the paralyzing peril I felt that night. I will begin, perhaps obviously, at the start. I am currently spending a year of my life teaching in Japan. I was able to enjoy some of Japan's wild landscapes during the later summer months of my arrival. Yet with the long winter we experience here, when spring came around I was itching to see as much of it as possible. Thus, the plan to hitchhike from my home just south of Kanazawa to Miyajima, a famously spiritual island just off the coast of Hiroshima, and back again began to unfold. I must add before I go any further that, although I remain open to the concept of spirituality, I have never before had reason to believe in demons or ghosts. Japan is the land of the spirit and the soul, and offerings to those that have departed this world can be found in every single place you look. However, these two I just believe to be rituals buried deep within their ancient culture. Aside from the few days me and some friends spent exploring Miyajima, I spent my time alone. My only conversations were with the abundance of locals I met who were politely inquisitive as to what I had in my hiking bag and the raccoons that I would less politely tell to fuck off when they woke me up in the middle of the night. Some of these nights were filled with the sounds of the city, an exchange made in my favor as I was then greeted by the dawning sun rising to highlight whatever historical monument I'd pitched my tent in front of. However, most of my nights were spent far away from the sounds of men and children. The blissful sounds of nature led me into my dreams. It is on one of these nights that my story takes place. It was nearing the end of my journey, and as such I had ticked most of the places off my list of things to do. So I asked my mom to choose my next destination and I woke up to very clear instructions on how to get to a secluded waterfall called Mino Falls. I know it is customary on this page to not reveal the location where these stories take place, and I hope my story is not removed due to my mentioning of it. But I tell this as a warning. Do not camp here. I checked the weather forecast for the area, showers it said. Some people feel the rain. Others just get wet. A quote by the great Bob Marley that I repeated to myself as rain lightly patted the windows. By this point in my journey I had given up trying to hitchhike. I was able to see much more by taking the inexpensive local train, and so it was on one of these many local trains I was sat, ready to just get wet. It was a good 50-minute walk away from the small town of Mino through a beautiful forest and the gorge created by the waterfall. On sunnier days, I am told it is an extremely popular place for tourists and locals alike. However, on this particular day I was greeted by few people. As with most of my walks along this journey, I took the less trodden path and wound my way up the side of this gorge further into thickness of the trees. The rain was quieter here, more muffled. The gray sky barely made it through the canopy, but there was plenty of residual light. I passed a small shrine on my left and smiled at the small cup of coffee placed on its mantle. My first reaction to seeing cups of coffee and bottles of water on shrines is always that of surprise. If you've ever been to Japan, you will notice a very immaculate landscape, void of any litter or bins. The phenomenon of placing cheap vending machine coffee on shrines I was told stems from the thought that the spirits are tired, and Japan being the highly caffeinated province it is, happily aids their weary guests. I inspected the shrine more closely. It didn't appear to be made out of stone, nor was there any head remaining. I shrugged it off as a product of time and made my way further down the path. The trees opened up slightly and the dappled light reflected at me from the damp trunks. The world was sodden and I really hoped that this waterfall had some sort of shelter for me to sleep under. Only 10 minutes past the previous shrine did I find another, an almost identical headless figure sat bow-legged with its hands by its sides. Less forest growth covered this one, less time had taken its toll, but it remained firmly headless. I decided to leave an offering of my own, something I had never done before but felt inclined to after my week of passing many a shrine without offering something in recognition. I had 2 plastic bottles, one empty and the other more than half full. I couldn't afford to leave all of my water, so I emptied some into the now filling bottle and left it by the shrine with its lid off. As I walked away, I toyed with the idea that this bottle would fill up every time it rained and the spirit would be happy. I had done a good deed today. I arrived at the waterfall just after lunch, and as I'd hoped, there was a large sheltered area which I scouted and deduced would be the best spot to pitch my tent for the night. The rain had turned the waterfall from what I would imagine is usually more of an attractive stream into a tremendous torrent of falling water. The 15-meter-high fall then ran its way back down a fairly magical-looking gorge and around a corner. I spent the afternoon reading, drinking whiskey, and trying not to get my camera wet. I didn't want to pitch my tent until evening lest the park rangers see me and tell me to pack up. Yet, as late as I waited, the evening patrol inevitably came past as I was finishing the construction of my anti-spider dome. Tendo Dame, accompanied with the bilingual gesture of making an X with one's arms, translates to something like, "Kind sir, this is a nature reserve and you can't pitch your tent here, so please pack it up and move." I nodded politely and feigned the start of my deconstruction. I regretted many times over the course of this night that I did not listen to the kind old man, that I did not heed his warning, that I probably misunderstood what he was trying to tell me, and that I did not ask him why I was not allowed to camp there. My only recompense for pursuing my cause of adventure is that I now have this story to tell. When they left, I began to search the area for somewhere out of the way that I could stay safely hidden from the mean park rangers that wanted me to destroy my home. I wish I could say I found somewhere with an even more beautiful view of the falls, but what I instead decided upon was a very large disabled bathroom. I measured the inside of the room with my paces, and to my bemused delight it was in fact more than enough space for the tent to fit. To my friend that lent me his tent and is yet to hear this story, and perhaps may read it here for the first time, the bathroom was suspiciously clean. I moved my tent into the room under the shade of twilight and began to hang my dripping clothes over the variety of handles one finds inside disabled toilets. Confident with my decision, and with the remaining light waning, I locked the door and got into my sleeping bag. It was a heavy hook-style latch attached to a heavy metal sliding door, perfectly bear-proof. After a minute, I had successfully deceived the motion sensor in the room and the light went off. I absorbed the darkness and let my ears take control of my mind. Something those of you who have camped alone before will know, is that the noise of the world around you becomes tantalizingly sharp once you zip yourself up into your cocoon. The slightest snuffle of a hedgehog must be a bear, and the wind that momentarily shakes your tent must be a person trying to get in. However, my agile-minded brain had taken me safely inside a bathroom and behind a locked door, so I felt unrecognizably secure. Shortly after I zipped myself up, the sounds of the patrol bike began to haunt me. It was hard to tell over the sounds of the waterfall exactly where the car was, so I sat up and braced myself for the inevitable knock 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 on the door, which would require me to pack up my tent in the rain and walk back through the forest at night. For nearly an hour I heard the sounds, vehicles moving around. I sat clutching my knees, ears pricked, preparing myself for what I deemed the only possible course of action. When I was finally greeted with the solitary sound of falling water, I released my knees and my breath simultaneously. My heartbeat began to subside and I braved turning on my head torch so that I could continue my book. I downed the remainder of my whiskey, and for a while I let myself escape from the room I was in. At around 11 p.m. I closed my book and surrendered my eyes to the darkness. I allowed my body to find a comfortable place and closed my eyes. The undisputable sounds of children laughing danced past me. Silence followed. My body froze. My skin grew cold. The only way I can describe the fear I felt would be to compare it to the paralyzing fear that comes from nightmares. But I was awake. When I mustered the courage to quietly unzip my sleeping bag, I reached for my phone and messaged my girlfriend and my mom, asking for them to tell me I am awake. I must have sounded crazy, but I needed to be sure. I locked my phone and continued to press my ears to the slightest sound. Unsure as to whether my ears were now creating what I expected to hear, the laughing was fainter or further away. I no longer trusted my ears. I was trapped. If I moved outside of my tent, the motion sensor would trigger and I'd be discoverable by whatever it was I had just heard. So in my tent I stayed. My hands grasped my phone, waiting for some external source to reassure me that I was not in fact dreaming. My rational brain had dissipated at this point. I knew my dream mother would also be able to tell me that I was awake, but I needed something. I heard the lock of bathroom click and swing. I locked my phone and silenced my breath. My mind raced with causes and reasons, and what my crazy mind kept coming back to was this forest spirits had led a bear to my home. Unlocking the door was their final task. I couldn't check even if I wanted to. I needed the darkness to hide. I heard the click and swing of the lock again. I don't know how much time passed before I dared unlock my phone again. But the message I needed was there. Both my girlfriend and mother confirmed my fears. I was awake. I quickly explained what was happening to them both. The last update they had previously was that I was hiding in a toilet. They had both found it very funny. Neither of them were laughing now. The logical woman my mother is tried to convince me that it was probably some kids getting drunk in their favorite spot away from their parents. Oh, how much I wanted to believe that was true. The distance from the town and the quantity of rain refused my brain to accept that truth. However, it is what I began to focus on. Then I remembered the lock and the impending bear attack. I found my pocket knife and placed it near my head. Did the spirit unlock it and lock it again to tease me? I waited for another eternity. My mother urged me to focus on my breathing. Knock, knock, knock. The dreaded sound from earlier in the night, which I had very gratefully acknowledged would not come, hammered down so much more fear than I had ever anticipated. The peril I experienced not half an hour before was back tenfold. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Silence. Nothing followed the knocking. The door didn't move. I tuned in on the sounds of the waterfall and focused on my breathing as per my mother's request. My mind's illusion of finding recognizable patterns within the randomness of the noises around me was now overwhelming. The laughing was still indefinable. I begged that it didn't come closer. A single loud knock brought a tear to my eye. Many a horror film I had seen and into the forest I expected to be taken. I shielded myself through closed eyes and clutched my only tangible connection to the outside world to my chest. My body tensed, bracing myself for whatever was about to come next. And like this my night was spent. I packed my tent up with the morning sun and was greeted with a gloriously gray, but dry, day. I told several people about my story. The Japanese among them were quick to believe and the foreigners among them were logically skeptical. I didn't know how to explain it very well. In the safety of my real home, hindsight shrouded my previous thoughts and I began to think of possibly more logical causes for my experience. I have toyed with the idea of monkeys, real children, dreams and illusions, yet nothing can explain everything I experienced. The overwhelmingly physical feeling of fear is something I will never forget. When I returned to work the next week, I was showing a colleague some of my photos, although importantly I had decided not to tell them the story. When I got to the photo of my tent by Mino Falls, he stopped me and said, "Oh, Mino. English difficult. Many, many ghosts." I couldn't tell him my story, but my skin crawled with the reminder that for the first time in my life, I was in the presence of something I cannot explain. The following morning, I parted my curtains and saw an empty plastic bottle sitting lidless on the sill. Story 2. Skinwalker birthday camping trip. High no sleep. Long line lurker / admirer, first time poster. Sorry in advance if this story is disappointing because it isn't very well structured. That's because it's true and happened to us last week. I'm not a very good writer, so please bear with me. Nonetheless, we thought you guys might get a kick out of our experience. Wednesday, June 6th was my boyfriend's birthday. We'd both requested that day off, but hadn't made any actual plans to do anything yet. When I got home from work around 4:30 the day before, he had made a spontaneous decision to go camping right now. There's a pretty well-known camping spot called Grayback Gulch only an hour away from us, Boise, Idaho, and, though I had never personally been there before, he had been there years before with his parents and grandparents and it was supposed to be beautiful. It is pretty deep into the woods considering Idaho is primarily a desert, not too far from civilization, and should have been an easy trip. We made a stop at Walmart for last-minute camping supplies, cheap second sleeping bag, dry firewood, food. Don't judge us, it was all very last minute, and took off towards the wilderness. We were in a time crunch because by the time we were packed it was pushing 6 p.m. and we wanted to make sure we got there before sundown to set up the tent. I sent a text to my mom with the location of the campsite and my boyfriend's license plate number, telling her we would be back sometime the next day. She is an amazing mom, but sometimes gets paranoid, and I didn't want her to panic if she couldn't get a hold of us. She would. Unrelated but kind of funny, the last song we listened to before our radio/cell service cut out was the front bottom song you used to say, "Holy fuck," which ends with the vocals trailing off repeating "Holy fuck. I'm about to die" over and over. It ended exactly as we hit the end of cell range, so after that, silence. We laughed about the seemingly ominous warning at the time and obviously kept going. After a relatively quick drive we started seeing the signs for Grayback Gulch and pulled off into the entrance to the Boise National Forest. The path was closed, with a big "No trespassing" sign strung across the dirt road. We awkwardly sat for a few minutes deciding what to do. We were both in the mood to camp and we were already there, but neither of us knew of any other campgrounds in that area off the top of our heads. We were only a few miles from Idaho City, so we got back on the highway and kept going. Idaho City, for those that haven't been there, is more of a tourist attraction than a city. I've actually never been there while it's open, but it's basically one of those charming little historical sites with saloons and blacksmiths and whatnot set up for people to go see what old-timey life was like. There's also a small motel, a gas station and a ranger station, so we headed to the ranger station for camping recommendations. A few minutes later we hit Idaho City and I shit you not, read it, the ranger station was closed. There was a piece of paper taped to the door explaining that it was their annual Ranger Field Training Day, so all rangers were out doing something else, and none of them would be available that day. Great. The only place that was open in Idaho City was a small market with an older woman working. She was nice enough, but clearly not into the whole tourist scene. We inquired about Grayback Gulch and she informed us that apparently the bridge leading to that campground had collapsed about a year ago. She told us there were two options: pulling off the side of the road somewhere along the forest by mile marker 31, back the way we'd come, or going about 7 miles further to a place called Bad Bear. We asked what she would choose and she just said, "Oh, I don't camp here." We were both a little sketched out about the idea of just sleeping off the side of the road, so we loaded back into the truck and headed to Bad Bear. Bad Bear was very small but very pretty. It's not one of those campgrounds with an RV hookup and drinking fountains, pretty much just a dirt patch cleared for a tent. The forest was pretty thick, no hiking trails leading away from the site or anything, just a short path from the highway up to the campground and a nearby narrow stream trickling down the mountain. There were 6 or 7 plots marked for camping. Each one had a picnic table, a fire pit and a big metal pole with a hook to hang your food away from any bears. As most campgrounds, there was a bulletin board at the entrance reminding campers to pick up their garbage and not leave any fires burning, along with envelopes and a drop box to put in your deposit. It was $15 per night for the single plots and $30 per night for doubles. As we went up to pay the deposit we noticed that every single other plot there had a sign saying it was reserved, but by this point it was 8 p.m. and no one else had shown up. There was also a porta potty up by the bulletin board, so I told my boyfriend to go ahead and start unpacking and I'd meet him back there in a few minutes. When leaving the porta potty I noticed some stairs that didn't seem to head anywhere just a few feet away. There did seem to be the makings of what could have been a trail, but after a few feet the dirt path ends. I'm not sure if they were planning on expanding the campground or building a trail or what, but being the no-sleep fan I am, I snapped a picture in reference to the famous Stairs in the Woods Reddit post. I heard my boyfriend calling for me to come quickly. There was something I needed to see, so I rushed back to our site. There, in the forest, just a few feet outside of our camp spot, was a definitely man-made little lean-to hovel. It seemed to be made mostly of bark that had been torn from trees. The hovel was pretty small, you probably couldn't fit inside of it unless you were a child, but inside there was a relatively deep, narrow tunnel that went down a few more feet. We figured maybe some kids made the hovel when they were here camping at some point, and after they left an animal took advantage of it and burrowed into it to make a home. I thought it was really cool, but it sketched my boyfriend out enough that we briefly discussed moving to one of the reserved spots to be further away from it. We didn't want to risk getting in trouble, so we shrugged it off and finished setting up the camp. I took a picture of the hovel to later show my father, a BLM forestry and fire service employee. We pitched the tent, he chopped wood and built the fire, and we settled in to roast some hot dogs and marshmallows. Now is a good time to mention that I have an eye disease called lattice degeneration. It means I have shitty eyesight to the point where over my life I've squinted so hard the muscles wore thin and tore. That's not actually how it works at all, but it's the easiest way to explain it. So far I've had 2 surgeries for it which repaired the tears but also made it so my pupils don't dilate anymore. This is only relevant because it's important to know that when it's too bright, or more commonly, too dark, I can't see at all. Debilitating night blindness. Huge pain in the ass. After sitting around the fire for maybe 45 minutes, the sun was falling behind the trees, and I realized exactly how dark it was going to get out there in the middle of nowhere. I nudged my boyfriend and told him that we probably had about 15 minutes before I go almost completely blind. Flashlights help, but not very much, because my eyes suck at high contrast lighting situations like that, so we both realized I'd be depending on him a lot if I needed to get up to go to the bathroom or anything. We sat and talked and ate for a while longer. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but I know it must have been about 11 p.m. now. We were getting to the point where neither of us were really tired, but it was now completely black out and we should probably turn in soon. The fire was slowly starting to die down. I looked at him sitting next to me and realized he was staring intently into the woods, in the direction of our tent. I tried to follow his line of sight but couldn't see anything past 2 feet in front of me. I pulled on his arm, asking what he saw. Without breaking his stare and in classic horror movie fashion, he calmly said, "Nothing, there's nothing," but kept staring. It was at this moment we both noticed how silent it was. There were no bugs, no crickets, no owls or frogs, just the quiet babbling of the stream nearby and deafening silence behind it. I pulled on his arm again. "Seriously, what do you see?" It was then I noticed that he wasn't staring at our tent, he was looking right past it, to the hovel. This time he stayed quiet. He is an experienced shooter and had his gun on his hip in case of bears, but sitting there in the blackness I felt like a sitting duck, getting more nervous by the second. I kept nervously looking in the direction he was trying to see anything to no avail. He stood up and tried to brush it off. "It's just so quiet," he said. "I really don't like that hovel." I thought I heard something moving. For some reason this calmed me down a little. The idea of a raccoon or deer being nearby was comforting compared to the absolute silence. I told him that whatever lived in the hovel was probably just returning home for the night. I meant it to be sweet, but I don't think he saw it that way. I tried starting up another conversation about something else, but after a few minutes he was staring intently again. Scowling. Finally, in a quiet voice he asked, "Would you be mad if we left?" "Left? Like, pack up and drive home?" "Yep." "Now?" "Yep." At this point, my heart was racing. I had no idea what he saw or thought he saw in the woods, and if anything happened and he took his gun and went to check it out, I would be sitting on a stump in the open, completely blind. I told him right now, "I can't see. I need you to see for me. That means I'm completely in your hands right now. If you think there's something out there, I have to believe you, because I don't know. So if you think we need to leave, we should leave." He handed me a flashlight and grabbed my hand, slowly leading me over the rocky terrain. We gathered up our food garbage, snuffed out the fire, and started packing. We were trying to hurry, but with me not being able to see and him not being willing to look away from the woods, it was a slow process. When it came time to start taking out the tent poles and breaking them down, I could barely reach the top to untie them from the tent, so he had to do it. I held the flashlight for him and he quickly demanded an "Oh, shine the light that way." I pointed the light towards the hovel and we broke down the tent in the dark. We were only a stone's throw from the truck, just on the other side of some bushes, so we made several short trips. We didn't bother putting the tent or sleeping bags away properly, just throwing them into the bed of the truck. The truck was probably only about 20 feet from the road with just a line of trees for privacy blocking the highway from the campground. It was on one of these trips back and forth while loading the truck he heard a man's voice, coming from the road. We were definitely close enough that we would have heard a car and seen headlights, so we knew that no one had driven up. It went on for several seconds. It sounded deep, but definitely human, although it sounded like gibberish. He described it as if someone was on the phone, just one voice, speaking, waiting for a response, and then speaking again. We of course knew for a fact that even if someone had somehow snuck to the campground without us noticing, there was certainly no cell reception. We went into borderline panic mode, making one last dash to grab the last of the important things and bolting to the truck, probably leaving some last scraps of food and garbage behind. Sorry, Earth. We threw everything into the bed of the truck and sped off to the freeway towards home. We drove in silence for several minutes. I get nervous when we drive at night because I can't see the road at all, so it's hard to fully trust anyone driving when you yourself can't keep an eye out for animals crossing or potholes or whatever. We had the brights on, but it was still so impossibly dark and quiet as we were driving through the forest. I snapped one last picture and we drove straight home. Eventually, on the hour-long drive, we calmed down a little bit. He apologized for making us leave, but said he just had such a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach, long before he ever heard the voice. I told him not to apologize, that I was glad to follow his gut on this one. I jokingly told him that, based on everything we experienced, if I actually believed in that stuff, I'd say we encountered a skinwalker. His face fell and he got very quiet, so I kept talking. I told him how in creepypasta, skinwalkers live in the wilderness and mimic the voices and conversations they hear, usually to lure people away from the group so they can eat them or whatever. After a couple minutes he confessed that makes sense, because it sounded just like my grandfather. He told me again how he'd been up camping in this general area before when he was a kid, with his parents and grandparents. He even remembers staying at Bad Bear once, but his father had horrible nightmares all night, so they never went back. Story 3. I went camping I don't think I'll ever go. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, demons, monsters, all just products of overactive imaginations, right? That's what I used to think until last fall when I went camping with a friend in a remote forest. We were looking for an escape from our busy lives and figured a weekend in the wilderness would be perfect. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, set up our tent, and gathered wood for a fire. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. We talked and laughed around the fire, but as the hours passed, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. My friend was out like a light, but I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling. That's when I heard it, a rustling just outside the tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard a low, guttural whisper, mimicking my friend's voice, calling my name. I shook my friend awake, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. My friend listened for a moment, then shrugged it off as my imagination. But I knew what I heard. Determined to prove I wasn't crazy, I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped out, scanning the area, but everything seemed normal. I was about to turn back when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight around and froze. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It looked like my friend, but something was off. The movements were jerky, unnatural, and the eyes, those eyes were empty, void of any humanity. The figure smiled, a chilling, predatory smile, and then it spoke in a distorted version of my friend's voice, calling my name again. Panic set in. I stumbled back into the tent and zipped it up, my hands shaking. I told my friend what I saw, but they insisted I was just tired and seeing things. Reluctantly, I lay back down, every sound outside now amplified in my mind. The next morning, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We left the forest, and I tried to forget what I saw, convincing myself it was a hallucination. Weeks later, I was at home when I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find my friend standing there, looking exhausted and terrified. They told me they had seen the same figure outside their window, mimicking my voice, calling their name. It followed them home. We decided to research what we encountered and came across stories about skinwalkers, creatures from Native American legends that could mimic voices and appearances to lure victims. The descriptions matched our experiences perfectly. Then came the twist I never saw coming. One night, while trying to calm my friend over the phone, I heard a faint noise behind me. I turned around to see my friend standing in the doorway, the same empty eyes and predatory smile as the figure in the forest. I realized too late the terrifying truth. The friend I had been talking to all this time, the one who had been followed home, wasn't my friend. They had been replaced by the skinwalker that night in the forest. And now, it was my turn to run. Story 4. We were stalked by a catacomb dweller in Paris. A few summers ago, I had the opportunity to study abroad in France. To say that it was an amazing experience would be an understatement. I absolutely loved it. For this trip, myself and 10 other students from my university, including our accompanying professor, would spend the month of June in Toulouse. But before our classes started, we would spend 4 days in Paris exploring and having fun. I didn't speak a lick of French going into this trip, but by the end, I would have learned quite a lot. This was because I never missed an opportunity to talk to someone. You'd be surprised by how much you learn a language by simply trying to speak to people in that language. I met so many people and had so many unique experiences because of this. We all did. However, there are times when someone you come across might be a little too eager to make friends. There are times when you have to know where to draw the boundaries. Our last night in Paris was one of those times, and thinking back on it, we were lucky, because things could have gone so much worse. After arriving at Charles de Gaulle Airport and getting settled in our hotel, we set out to explore the city. Over the course of those 4 days, we saw Musée d'Orsay, the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower and the Champ de Mars, Versailles, and Notre Dame, from a distance, as this was right after the fire, and of course, enjoyed the amazing food the city had to offer. We had more gelato and macarons than I could count. It was a great time. However, I had also wanted to take a tour of the Paris catacombs. Unfortunately, time was a concern and I didn't want to be out in the city alone without cell service to communicate with the others. On our last day, after dinner, some of our group decided to turn in for the night, to prepare for tomorrow morning's train ride south to Toulouse. However, 6 of us, including myself, we'll call the others Natalie, Dan, Ari, Maria, and Oscar, felt the night was still young. Besides me, everyone was under 21, and since France's drinking age is 18, they wanted to make the most of it. Overall, we wanted to enjoy Paris as long as we could. Besides, we could just sleep on the train tomorrow. We headed off, hopping from bar to bar until around 10 p.m., when we found one the girls liked. It was on a small, narrow stone brick road, lined with other small restaurants and bars, their outdoor seating areas filled with people. Inside, we found ourselves a round table and got drinks. I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the girls, Natalie, had been dropping hints on me the entire trip, and through my complete obliviousness, I had inadvertently rejected her and made her upset. As callous as it sounds, I wasn't really too concerned. I was having the time of my life. While I was waiting for my beer at the bar, a tall boy who looked roughly our age came up to me. He had curly brown hair and thick stubble. "Are you American?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, chuckling. "How did you know?" "Come on, my friend," he replied in a matter-of-fact kind of tone. "The way you look, the way your friends are acting over there, it is very obvious. Everyone here can tell." I laughed, slightly embarrassed, and we started up a friendly conversation. I found out that he was a student at Paris Sorbonne University, and worked in the metro during the summer. At least, that's what he said. After a few minutes, we had become friendly enough that I invited him to our table. He seemed very excited to meet everyone. Introducing himself as Hugo, he was an instant hit. Especially with all three of the girls in our group, who seemed immediately drawn to him. He was simply magnetic in the way he spoke and carried himself. His face seemed almost fixed in a warm, inviting smile, which showed off his nearly perfect teeth. Of course, the French accent certainly gave him charisma points. Natalie in particular was hooked. She almost never took her eyes off of him as soon as he sat down. After everyone introduced themselves, we began talking about our trip and what we were doing on our study abroad semester. We talked about the US and all the stereotypes associated with it, which brought laughs amongst everyone. Hugo became the life of the party, even offering to buy our whole table drinks. At one point, Dan and I even sang along when a song in English happened to be playing, which amused Hugo. Natalie was laughing the hardest at all of his jokes, even flirtatiously grabbing his arm and brushing his shoulder, though we weren't entirely sure if it was because she was tipsy or if she was actually into him. Hugo was well enough aware and bought her more drinks, mainly Moscow mules, whenever she asked. He would just say, "Of course, Moncho," and pull out another euro banknote from the seemingly endless supply in his pocket. He offered us his cigarettes as well, thought it came as a surprise to him when he found out none of us were smokers. In one instance of attempting to produce another euro note from his pocket, he accidentally dropped something else out, the sound of a plastic material smacking the wooden floor of the bar. Ari was sitting next to him, and upon hearing the sound, reflexively looked to see what it was. As Hugo leaned over and reached down to retrieve the object, Ari quickly looked back up. Eventually, after hearing about our time in Paris and the places we had visited, Hugo asked us if we had been to the catacombs. I told him that while it was something we would be interested in, we simply never got around to it. "Oh, that is too bad," he said. "This is your last day too. And the last tour ended hours ago." "Yeah, it sucks," Ari said, though from her tone, she wasn't all too concerned. "Well, maybe next time. The catacombs are fantastic, I think you really should have gone." Hugo was suddenly transfixed on the topic, now that he had brought it up. "I love it. Imagine, a city of the dead, under our feet. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, much of them unknown. No way, dude, Dan had probably had a drink too many, several drinks ago." "Sounds spooky," said Maria. "Maybe you should take us next time we're here." "Why wait?" Hugo paused, his voice suddenly slowing down. "Why don't we go tonight?" "What do you mean?" Ari asked. She could handle her liquor, and now she had suddenly sharpened up. I think we all knew what Hugo was implying, though none of us were willing to say it out loud. "I mean, we visit the catacombs. I can take you there. Think of me as your personal tour guide." Hugo's smile never left his face. "Yeah, totally," Dan shouted. "How?" I asked. "They're closed. And most of the tunnels are restricted." "Mon ami, trust me," Hugo said. "I go down there all the time. Me and my catacomb friends. We know the tunnels. We know how to get in. There are secret entrances all over the city. No one knows about them but us." By now my friends and I were looking over at each other nervously, not sure of what we should do. "That's very interesting, Hugo," Oscar said facetiously, trying to hint at him to change the conversation. But Hugo continued, "You will see it's true. Trust me. Tonight we're having a party down there. Lots of people. We have music, drinks. You want Rose? We have Rose. We have weed, ecstasy, blow, all of it." He looked down at Natalie, who was curled up under his arm. "You want to come, Moncho?" "I do," Natalie said, grinning. By now she was very drunk.